Welcome to another enriching episode of Highly Sensitive Money. In this installment, I talk with Jasmine Rashid, an impact investment advisor and author of the upcoming book, The Financial Activist Playbook. The discussion covers Jasmine's journey into financial activism, her personal experiences, and powerful insights for those looking to align their financial practices with social justice. Jasmine shares her experience growing up in a family that had experienced financial upward mobility while dealing with generations of a scarcity mindset. It's truly a pleasure to hear Jasmine's story and be inspired by her hope turned into action. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. Welcome to Highly Sensitive Money. My name is Yanez, and I'm excited to have Jasmine here. Jasmine and I met at Our Money Ourselves, a 2-day gathering put together by the California Women's Foundation. Can you share a little bit about where you are right now? And also, if you want to share your story about how you got into working in social justice and money. I loved what you shared over at Our Money
Yeah,
Ourselves.
happy to. It's funny. I feel like every time I'm asked to share my money story, I don't know what's going to come up during it. And I think that was definitely the case during the Our Money Ourselves gathering. But I'm currently based in Oakland, California. I've been here for about 5 years. And the kind of high level overview of my work is that I work at an impact investment advisory firm. I'm their director of impact. And I am the author of the upcoming book, The Financial Activist Playbook. And so the surface level answer of my financial background growing up is that I was middle class in suburban America. But I think for so many of us, those kind of titles, they're surface level. It goes a lot deeper than that, right? And so I grew up as an only child who was both very loved and also very confused because I was the only mixed race person that I remember knowing. My dad and his people are from South Asia. My mom, her family is Italian, Eastern European immigrants. So I showed up on this earth very blessed and also very much without a blueprint, living in one of the most segregated counties in the United States. And I think when I say that, people often assume I'm talking about the deep south, but I'm talking about New York. I'm talking about Long Island. And before I had the language for it, I knew that the community I grew up in was segregated, even when other people were calling it diverse. Because even though people across, class and race were living in close proximity, they were living very different realities from one block to the next. So I always had this kind of angst about inequality, financial inequality among neighbors and cousins. And at a very young age, I started doing what I now know to be organizing around those issues. But getting back to the specific financial background, my money story is really rooted in the fact that my dad immigrated from Bangladesh in the late 80s. And he was kind of a rebel, really drawn to Western rock and roll. He landed in Bakersfield, California. And actually, he was just here this weekend and was telling me that kind of what prompted him on the next stage of his journey was that he watched a movie called Wall Street, which I actually haven't seen, the Michael Douglas movie. I need to maybe this weekend sit down and actually watch it. But assuming it's a lot of chaos and hustle and if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. So with after watching that movie with very little, connections or money or plans really, he moved to New York. He met my mom on his second day in Queens. She was working at a car dealership, and he walked in and applied for a job. It was all very coming to America. And eventually, after some time being proximate to Wall Street, he did, in fact, learn how to play this chaotic game and became a stockbroker in the bustling New York 90s. So, made a little money. He and my mom moved to Long Island. They had me in 96. And I obviously don't consciously remember a ton of my earlier years, but apparently it was a time of, I guess you could describe it as financial volatility, in that one year making a ton of money, the next year not so much, and kind of that pattern for quite some time. But fortunately, in the years between 9/11, the stock market crash, he transitioned out of being a stockbroker and became a certified financial planner, which was a stabilizing force and meant we saw a decent amount of upward mobility in a relatively short amount of time. I think more than most people see in their lifetimes. And so, like, the neighborhood my parents live in now, Long Island, is very different than the neighborhood I grew up in. And so I have this privilege of not only experiencing upward mobility, but I also had a built in financial advisor at home to ask all my silly money questions, to poke and prod at like why things are the way they are in our financial system and the strategies for like wealth creation and wealth hoarding under capitalism. Like I had that really intimate access to understanding these very practical, you know, ins and outs of finance. And then maybe more on the like emotional, spiritual aspect of that, I also know what it's like to experience financial stability and financial mobility and still have to navigate generations worth of scarcity mindset, right? And how our economy continues to be rooted in white supremacy and everything that comes with that. So, rethinking our financial systems and healing personal and collective trauma related to our financial systems has always been a really deep interest of mine. And that's why my work today sits at the intersection of, like you mentioned, money, social justice, and well being.
It was a perfect answer, perfect answer. And you experienced a lot of like financial mobility when you were young. How do you see that continue to impact you today, if at all?
Yeah, it definitely continues to impact me in ways that I'm not expecting in terms of the financial decisions that I make right now. My fiance and I are planning our wedding, right? And so bringing in the generosity of our families and also coming to a sense of what does my enough look like, and that might be different than what, you know, my parents enough looks like, or what other folks ideas of like financially enough might look like. Or yeah, there's just so many pieces where this kind of feeling like I straddle classes in some way, like I don't have a particularly strong like class identity, and that's something that I think a lot of us don't talk about in terms of, I think we've gotten really good at talking about gender identity and racial identity and like leaning into systems of support for that. But when it comes to class and really navigating like what is ours to do, I don't even think most people, you know, fully like know how much money is in their bank accounts without like, you know, like, or in all of their accounts kind of put together, right? And I think even for me as someone who works in finance, I still have moments where I kind of revert to like child self and I'm a little bit like, I don't know how to money. I don't know how to do any of these things. And so,
Mhm.
yeah, I don't know if that quite answered the question, but continues to show up for me and be a source of both privilege and confusion.
And that's so common. I was talking with a friend earlier today, also somebody who works in finance, about how we can be an expert on money. And I always tell clients I can be an expert on money, but I'm not an expert on your life. And sometimes it feels like I'm not even an expert on
Right.
my own life, right? Like, what is the right decision? I may know intellectually what I should do, and yet, does that actually make sense? It's kind of like I know what my plate should look like at every meal, right? Like half of it should be veggies, a quarter of it should be this, a quarter of it should be that. Do I apply it every time? Do I apply it overall? It is a bit of a moving target. Now, what do you when you think about our current financial system and like your deep understanding of it, right? As someone who works in finance, someone who's been very socially active, do you feel hopeful, despondent? What is your view on where we are?
That's a that's a great question. I saw a quote earlier today. I'm not remembering who it was by, but it was something to the effect of wonder and awe can't live in the same realm as despair. And so, in the choices between despair and like hope or like wonder or like imagining, I've had to like build some real muscle around choosing the latter, choosing wonder, choosing hope. And so the work that I do, you know, it started, my kind of financial activism started as really in the realm of fighting against oppressive systems in the kind of just transition framework of like how do we stop the bad. And so I did a lot of divestment work around private prisons, right? That work was really fulfilling and really exhausting, and it made me realize that perhaps I am better suited to sustain my work if I'm actually on the side of building the better. So making sure we're supporting how do we move away from the bad, but also having a clear what are we investing in? What are we building towards? And so that definitely is what keeps me hopeful. Hopeful is, I think hope is like a radical act of, you know, reimagining. So yeah, I tend to be optimistic and also pragmatic and also have my heart broken all the time. And that's just what it is, I think, for me to be in this work. But finding sources of hope is really something I need to stay sustained in this work. And I think that's why I'm so drawn to being a not even a storyteller, but like a conduit for other people's stories, right? To like take time to actually listen to other stories of financial activism, of people, creating new systems within our financial system kind of against the odds, and then being able to really steward those stories to inspire other people. I feel like I've kind of been identifying that more and more as my work to do in this current state.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And the just transition framework, for anybody who's not familiar, I'll include links to what that means. But when we talked about divestment, right, it was screening out those private prisons, saying those are not going to be part of how I grow my wealth. And that focus on building the good, creating the alternatives that we can go to. And we have to have a sense of hope in our work in order to continue doing this. Turning over to your book, I'd love to hear more about what inspired you to write it, who supported you in that
Yeah.
process.
Yeah, it's been a journey. It's still a little bit surreal. I've always been drawn to books and the idea of being a writer and being an author, but this was kind of unplanned. The genesis of the book started really in 2020 when I think so many of us were just grappling to meet the moment, trying to figure out what our contributions are in a time in which, the general public is paying attention to things like massive police violence, paying attention to things like overinflated police budgets that aren't actually serving communities. And so I had written a Medium article called A Financial Activist Playbook for supporting the movement for Black lives. And it was just kind of my attempt to, give folks a sense of like, here are your options for supporting Black owned banks and companies, and kind of just listing things that I knew that everyday people would find accessible. And the reason that that's the audience I wanted to focus on is because in my day job, working with ultra high net worth individuals, I'm getting to learn so much, right, over the past 5, 6 years about different strategies around impact investing and philanthropy. And often everyday people who are working class and middle class are left out of those conversations, right? So there's the irony of, having a field that is working for social change, but we know that the people at the forefront of social change are often those who don't come from wealth, right? Who are actually need to be the ones who are creating solutions so that we're not just focusing on the center, but we're focusing on the margins. And so I created that guide as my kind of way to like tend to like what I felt as like my people, like the people that I come from, the everyday person. And that is what I think I wasn't really expecting, but a lot of like organizations started reaching out and saying like, oh, we want to start implementing financial activist practices. We want to take a look at our supply chain. We want to take a look at how we're spending our budgets. And so I began doing these like workshops, and public speaking is not my thing. I'm a writer, like I said, to my core. And so I had this idea that if I could just kind of put all the options in like a menu into like one offering and then give it to people that they can figure out like what is the wealth that they have access to that they can activate in line with social change movements. And that project kind of kept expanding, really thinking about the idea again of not even just financial wealth, but what are all forms of wealth that people can be tapping into. And I realized that what my book is really responding to is the late, great Alice Walker's quote that the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. And so my goal with this book, my calling with this book is really, I think, to speak to that sense of hope, right? To say like, let's name like how, terrible so many of our systems are and financialization, and like really begin to understand the ways in which we have growing wealth inequality, and provide very real stories that are relatable, that are accessible, provide exercises and activities for people to just begin where they are and reclaiming decision making around their own money, around money that they're connected to, as a part of this broader work of reclaiming wealth, reclaiming collective well being, and realizing that we often have more power and influence than we have been told as everyday people, especially as women, especially as people of color.
Yeah. So it's really about hope and creating a playbook, just like the title of the book is, right? It's a playbook.
Yeah, and it's an invitation to play, which we don't usually associate with finance, right? A finance is supposed to be very hard and linear and black and white and binary, and I much prefer to live in the land of nuance and color and imagination. And I take that as seriously as I think kind of the hard numbers aspect. Yeah.
When we first met, I shared what this project was about, the Highly Sensitive Money podcast, and you immediately said that you also identify as highly sensitive. I'd love to hear, how do you see that impact your work as a financial activist?
Yeah. I was so excited to realize that you were doing this because it is a I don't know what percentage of the population identifies as highly sensitive.
It's about 15 to 30% depending on how you measure it.
Yeah. And I feel like there's so many of us in social justice spaces, like maybe we're overrepresented. And I realize that that is such a gift. And it also comes with challenges that we need to be talking about more in terms of the ways that we prevent ourselves from burnout, right? From, you know, all the kind of compounding trauma. So I guess I'll say, like, as a highly sensitive kid, I grew up feeling like I didn't really belong because I straddled these multiple identities. But now, so I just turned 28 this weekend. And so I know that I still have many, hopefully many years to go and learn.
Congratulations.
Thanks. But I feel like I have a much stronger sense of who I am, and I have a much clearer sense of how my ability to straddle actually makes me really well primed to be a bridge, to be a connector, to be a weaver. And like I mentioned, my financial activism is about helping people see their own power. Like, I can't tell any someone, here is the amount of wealth that you have, right? Like, we can pull together your net worth and do all those pieces, but only someone in their own lived experience understands the networks of wealth around them. They understand the particularities of how the financial system shows up in very material ways in their own lives. And so my my work in financial activism is really just beginning to illuminate the ways in which financial systems do play very real roles, and then giving people tools to start addressing those pieces rather than saying, I know all the things, here is, being very kind of prescriptive. I like to just maybe be more, provide a menu, like I mentioned before, of offerings that if people want to click deeper into some of the strategies, I know how to connect them. And I know people who know a lot about many different things in the financial system. So my role is not to be an expert in everything, and no one knows everything, but we all know a lot of things. And also, I'm often, in addition to being highly sensitive in my work in the realm of investment advisory services, I'm also often the youngest person in the room. And that's a perspective that I think for a long time I tried, like my kind of sensitivity, I tried to really dampen or not lean into or see as a weakness, but realizing that I am someone who's thinking about 30, 40, 50, 60 years, down the line, whereas folks who may be running our current financial systems are thinking a lot more short term, quarterly, you know? So, yeah, that I think the ability to be like really attuned to people, I guess empathetic is something that shows up daily in my work of financial activism.
Yeah. And you mentioned at the beginning that it feels that highly sensitive people are overrepresented in social activism, and it may be true. I don't know if there's been studies done on like what the percentage is in the general population versus in different parts of the workforce. I remember when I was researching more, when I was learning more about highly sensitive people, one of the traits is being really, because we can be more permeable, like outside pain kind of comes in much more vibrantly, to use a positive word.
Mm.
We're more likely to connect to other people's pain, to connect to other people's discomfort, which is maybe what brings us into activism. One of my favorite parts of learning about myself as highly sensitive, it was definitely learning like what doesn't work, but some of the gifts are seeing connections where other people may not see connections because we're just getting more information in, right? And that can make us more imaginative. And I just love hearing all the hope that you hold, because that's an area where I struggle. But I see you continue to be like, no, there's things that we can do. There's always new ways of moving in this financial world and in all parts of our lives. Can you share for people who identify as highly sensitive, and apart from like buying your book, where else could people go for resources on bringing more activism into their money?
Yeah, so I think especially for highly sensitive folks, but really for anyone who exists today and lives under modern capitalism, we all have some form of trauma. Because if you define trauma as something that impacts your not only your sense of safety, but your sense of self, your sense of identity. And so I think, our current financial systems often make us question our value, make us question so many questions about who we are. And one of the best resources that I've had to support myself in able to continue doing the work of activism has been the trauma of money method. And so trauma of money, it's based actually in Canada, but they are international. It's a virtual offering. I think it's a 17-week course founded by Chantel Chapman and other amazing, amazing folks who are experienced or trauma informed practitioners, as well as financial coaches and advisors. So essentially, it's a program that brings folks together to really look at the role of trauma and as it relates to money in our daily lives. And I think it has a kind of personal finance focus, but it goes beyond personal finance and like financial literacy, because it asks us to pay attention to our nervous systems and realize that if we're just getting information about, how to budget better or how to open a, 401k, if we're operating from an activated nervous system, we're operating from an activated state, we're just going to be reacting, right? We're not going to actually be able to make decisions that we might otherwise make if we were feeling more nourished and resourced. And so the trauma of money method really helps folks learn how to decrease shame around money, right? Like to ask questions like, I'm feeling some things when I'm, going to the bank. Like, what is this? What is this about? As instead of just trying to push those feelings away. So decrease shame and increase discernment. So beginning to actually like trust ourselves with money, to think about the ways in which we, a very much like a asset based approach as opposed to a deficit based approach. And so I think the work of healing our own money trauma is like often a step that I think people skip over and just jump straight into the activism. And there's so many just horror stories of the ways in which when people don't tend to their own trauma, it shows up, right, in activist spaces and movement spaces. And so I really, really recommend the trauma of money, because even for me, I joined to become a trauma of money certified practitioner. And I was like, oh, this will be really good. So I can like, help friends like navigate their salaries and just like have more offerings. And I realized it was actually, I needed it for myself. So again, this idea of like, even those of us who are in financial spaces and like in some spaces are seen as experts, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of unlearning. It's a lot of, you know, claiming our power. And I think that, yeah, the trauma of money method is just such a beautiful community to do that with.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of great things about it, definitely. I love reminding people that when we're activated, when our system is dysregulated, when we're not feeling safe, when we're feeling like we have to fight, it's almost impossible to create a system that's peaceful
Yeah.
because we're coming from a place that's so
that's the opposite of peaceful, right? If you're coming from war, how could you imagine peace? And when I start my workshops, I always invite people to check in with how are they feeling right then? How is their body feeling right then? What are the sensations? Is their stomach tight? Is their breathing shallow? Is it deep? And going over the different ways that our body responds is right. It's like fight, flight, freeze, fawn. It's all of those different automatic responses that we may not be aware of, but that get very activated with anything that has to do with our safety. And money is one of those things that really is rooted to our sense of well being. And especially in very individualistic countries or in very individualistic cultures where we're asked as individuals to care for all of our needs, it can be very activating. Where we're asked, whereas individuals we're expecting money to take care of all of our needs, it can be very activating to go into the topic. So yes, definitely the trauma of money is a great resource, and it's something, it's not enough to just like go to a personal finance 101 class and learn how to diversify your portfolio. You also need to learn how do you have conversations with money with your loved ones, even with yourself.
Yeah. And for some people, they may be at the state where they do need that personal finance 101, right? But like, if that were the solution, we'd live in a very different society right now. If that were the, point blank solution, like we just need more financial education. Yes. And exactly to your point, we need more trauma informed, more conscious, more just attending to the lived realities of people and their senses of self. So it goes deep for sure.
Yeah, education is often not enough to create behavior change. Knowing what you should do doesn't make doing it any easier.
Totally. Yeah. I'm a huge
Yeah.
behavioral economics nerd and read all the the social psychology books, and humans are both very predictable and also very irrational, and I think that there's so much beauty in that. Like we're both rational and irrational, depending on like what side of the coin you're looking at. And so yeah, just like being like accepting that, right? Accepting that we have so much nuance within us. And so rather than feeling shame about not knowing how to navigate a system full of contradictions, just attending to it in ways that are both healing as well as enjoyable.
Yeah. And the shame, like what I remember about learning about shame through Brene Brown was that shame comes from feeling that we're going to be kicked out of the group. The group's not going to allow us back in. And as inherently social creatures, that's like the same as death, especially if you're very, very young. So that shame that gets signaled with money is really, it can feel life or death, even though we know that it isn't in most cases.
Also, can you hear him snoring now? You can? Okay, we're
I
fine.
can.
I'm gonna move him. I'm so sorry. Come here, buddy. Come on, sleep with sister. Over here. Come here. Come on, buddy. He loves to just be directly under me.
That makes sense. Mine too.
I'm gonna put him with his sister who's on the other side of the room and be a good girl.
Yeah, my dog lives on my couch, sleeping with her face inside the cushion. There's my dog, just like face and cushion, happy as can be.
So cute.
And sometimes you can hear her little feet. Like if you listen closely on the podcast, you can feel her little feet being like, "Is it walk time? Are we going out?" So I have the question.
Okay.
When we're talking about money, there's such a huge taboo about just bringing up the subject, right? I remember this really funny study that all of these social science researchers were at a park and they were asking people about their sex life. How many partners have they had? When was the last time they had sex? What's their favorite position? People were a little shy, but they'd open up and let the social science researchers know everything. When it came to money, what their net worth was, what their debt was, their income, people had nothing to say. They were so clammed. How do you deal with the taboo around money? And also more specifically, in your work, do you do personal finance with people or is it more at looking at strategies?
Yeah. It's so funny. I also looked at a study that was like people would rather like miss a flight, wait in line at the DMV, like, like lose their wallet, like all these things, than actually just talk to someone about money. And so, you know, I guess in my work as in organizer and as a writer, and really in the context of this book, I'm trying to bring exercises to people to like actually just like again play with the idea of talking about money. I have one of my elders, Akaya Winwood. She always jokes that one day she's going to get a room of people together and just ask them point blank, how much money do you have? And just and just like see what happens. Like, because there is this sense that like the world will just implode if we actually talked about our money. And so getting people to at least think about like, why is that? Like bring some curiosity to that, and then begin having money conversations, starting with your money story, right? Like again, understanding the different identities, different values that you hold around money, because it is complex. And then actually just beginning to share that money story with trusted loved ones, with people who you already are in like deep relationship with, is really good practice to then get to the point where, oh, why don't we actually like help support one another in thinking about what our, desired income levels are, and help thinking about how much we should be saving for retirement, right? Like, what if we saw one another as resources to actually look our money in the face? One thing I love from the author Berna Anat, who has the book that came out last year called Money Out Loud, which is specifically about this topic, is she hosts like a tax brunch where she gets her girlfriends together and they just like do their taxes together, right? So trying to again bring some like, and I think they have like mimosas and like snacks and like try to make it like a fun gathering. And I think there's something so subversive and powerful about talking about money, and it is one of the taboos that I think society just hasn't caught up to yet. And I think that's really like, I do see that as one of the taboos that I'm really excited for millennials and Gen Z to just begin having more dialogue around.
And it's one of those things that we have to be careful with. I remember at one of my previous jobs, during my salary review or like my performance review, I asked point blank, like, how does my salary compare to other people in my position, specifically men and white women? And they couldn't tell me. I wasn't expecting them really to be like, oh, so and so makes this much money and so, like, but I know that their response later was impacted by that question. And then I remember later at a very different space, it was an HR finance related event. And I shared that question. Like, how do I help my clients ask that question? And an HR person that worked at a major bank said, you're not supposed to ask that question. Like, it's actually dangerous to your job to ask that question. Right. And that makes sense. Like it's easier to exploit workers who are uninformed. And that's why it's so important for us to go out and look at how do our wages compare to everything else. And that's just talking about the earning portion of it, which is very important as women, people of color. We got to ask these questions. But think about there's some spaces where it's unsafe to ask the questions, but that doesn't mean that all spaces are unsafe.
Right.
And it's really important for us to have the capacity to have these conversations, even just within ourselves, so that we can really be real about what's working and not working.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I think again, like to bring up spaces like trauma of money, like having that trauma informed approach to, because a lot will come up. Like I think for anyone who's been asked to share their money story, I even said at the top of this episode that like, I don't know what's going to come up because I'm continuously learning. And there were so many years spent trying not to think about it because that's what you do culturally. Right. And so it is like approaching it with curiosity. A lot comes up, and sometimes it's painful and sometimes it's joyous, but again, creating the spaces with your partner or your best friend to just start practicing and holding space for one another, I think really is like step one to like culture transformation. And we already are seeing like states passing legislation that you cannot ask employees about their you cannot retaliate against employees for like sharing their salaries with one another. There's mandates that people have to put the salary range on the job posting, which thank God, because I remember so many times applying for jobs and being like, so are we talking $20,000 or 80? Because that's a big difference, right? So having, more of that, I think mandated is going to be helpful, but we need people to advocate for it and to push for it in the first place, because you're right, status quo is perfectly happy keeping things in the dark.
One of the things that can be really kind of nebulous, that it's unclear what we're talking about, is the word activism. And then you add in financial activism. And not only are we a little confused about what activism is, but we're also like, should we be talking about this again, given the money taboo? What have been your favorite examples of financial activism? And I'd also love to like framing that question. But another question that immediately comes up to me is like, who are your role models in this world?
Yes. Oh, I love this question. So, yes, finance for so many of us feels way over there. It's very intentional, exclusionary. And for so many of us, activism can feel way over there, like, especially for folks who may be like introverts or who don't come from, from legacies or identities of being activists. But I think for so many of us, like, actually just thinking through the communities we come from, the ways in which the values of advocating for self and others have really been seminal to the ways we live our lives. Like, so many of us are already activists without claiming that identity. And so many of us are making money decisions every single day, right? If you're budgeting, or if you're pulling up at the checkout at the grocery and you're trying to figure out how much you can pull from this account and how many coupons you have, or like, these are all money decisions. And just because they're not, trading stocks, they're still financial decisions. And so letting people know that they're already interacting and making decisions about money every single day, as well as making decisions that do or do not align with social movements that are working towards broadly decreasing the inequality that has been engineered in our societies, as well as environmental devastation. And so the examples of financial activism that I like to give to remind people that it is our work to do, even if we're not financial experts or even if we don't see ourselves as activists, is just thinking about like where our money is at any given time. What are our banking partners thinking about our, consumer habits? Where are we spending our dollars? Thinking about our retirement plans, right? For those of us who have retirement plans, and what that's investing in. Thinking about the ways in which we donate or we give and we receive, and really challenging the kind of concept of philanthropy, of looking of this power dynamic of only, ultra high net worth or wealthy people have the right to be philanthropists, when in reality the majority of charitable giving comes from people who are low to moderate income, who are just, giving has been culturally significant in so many different ways, right? And so I give examples of people, like historical examples of folks who decided, okay, the banks are not going to, they have no interests in our community besides exploiting our communities. How can we create a credit union, or how can we create an alternate system that is actually going to serve us rather than serve folks outside of community? And so a recent example that I've really just been loving, and there is actually a documentary about it, Arlo Washington, the barber of Little Rock. And so Arlo Washington, who I haven't had the pleasure to meet yet, but I do reference in my book, was a barber at a barber school in Little Rock, Arkansas. And this is a place where predatory lending in Arkansas was deemed illegal, which is great, but there were no financial institutions that were able to fill the gap. And so people were still turning towards different forms of predatory lending that were becoming really dangerous. And so what began happening was people would go to the barber school and essentially ask for it to be a place of lending money so that they could, engage in learning to become barbers, and essentially became a kind of informal lending circle or bank, this barber shop in a really central piece of the community. And so this is not something that like everyone should or like has the capacity to do, but Arlo Washington decided that he was going to develop the first credit union, I think since, I don't know, decades, in the state, and actually went through with getting what's called the People's Trust as the first like community development financial institution that is like federally recognized, so that, there's this idea of like moving from like barber to banker, but still knowing that he's playing this role in community where, yeah, people, when they engage locally, when they actually, you know, are operating in financial systems where you're seeing face to face rather than this kind of nebulous idea of like someone like on a screen somewhere very far away, that you can have really successful like collective wealth building, right? That personal wealth building and collective wealth building can be and should be intertwined if we really want to change our financial system. So that's just one success story of a financial activist that I think is inspiring a lot of people right now. And yeah, no one gave him permission. No one said like, yes, you are certified to be able to open a financial institution. He just looked up how to do it. And now here we are. And they've been able to make so many life-changing loans to people so that they don't have to turn to predatory lenders.
Wow, that's amazing. It's like he saw a need, filled a need.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
And what about money mentors? When it comes to money, we often don't have a lot of people whose footsteps we want to follow. Again, because it's so taboo, we're not really sure. We think we should know how to do it without actually being taught how to do it. And I'd love to hear, like, for you and your experience and your own personal finance experience, who has guided you in incorporating your activism into your money, into how you do money?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I just want to name, it's not a particular person, but a community that's been really, really vital for me. I mentioned Trauma of Money, but the other piece for me has been the Just Economy Institute. So that's a fellowship that I did when I was first starting to think about my book. And essentially, it brings together folks who are historic wealth holders, who are activists, who are financial intermediaries, and just kind of puts us all in a space together to like figure some stuff out, right? There isn't even a particular like challenge beyond the fact that we're often so siloed. Having those spaces where we connect just as like human beings. So, for context, Just Economy Institute happens on a beautiful ranch here in California where we're really well fed and we just get to like be together on the land. And starting with that premise of us just like as human beings without the labels of like wealth holder or activist or whatever it may be, opened up so many possibilities for me in like just having more curiosity about the ways in which people make, adulting decisions. Like, again, as the person, I think I was the youngest person in the space of figuring out, oh, how do you and your partner? I have a really dear friend, Ariel Brooks. Her and her partner walked me through how they think about like enough budgeting for their family, like how they think about what enough looks like, how they, on a like monthly basis sit down and like look through their finances together and approach so from this view of like collaboration and abundance, right? As opposed to this is like a like ugly task that we just have to do because someone told us we have to do, right? And so that's just an example of everyday people who are just figuring it out as they go provides so much inspiration to me because it humbles me and it reminds me that there isn't, one blueprint of how to navigate money. We can only keep iterating and experimenting and approaching our money and aligning our money with our values as an ongoing experiment makes it a lot less intimidating, I think. So that's one community, the Just Economy Institute, that I think really just fosters a sense of curiosity around the ways we can integrate our own money as well as the money that we have access to working with our activism. And I also, I think in a similar vein, really want to shout out my partner, my fiance Chase, who has really made evident how much of a difference growing up with like an abundance mindset versus like a scarcity mindset can affect everyday decisions like grocery shopping, right? Or like all of these pieces. And I think we balance each other out really well. But he has been really amazing in reminding me that like if you spend money today, it's not going to be the end of the world, right? Like And there's definitely times where we've had moments where I'm like, this is like super uncomfortable. But just knowing that like we both come from families that are super supportive, that always will be safety nets for us. And he's helped me see that blessing as a blessing, right? And be able to lean more into that. And I think just come with a spirit of generosity that I want to emulate in the world, but I also need to accept in kind of all directions. And so, yeah, I guess he's would be kind of a money mentor for me as well, even though I've never thought about him in that capacity.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. What a beautiful partnership and money. And I hope that in many ways, congratulations on your upcoming wedding.
Thank you.
I love what you just said about like, there's no right way to do money. And these conversations that you were having at the Just Economy Institute, and also the conversations that you have with your partner. I love quoting, I mean, this is from Morgan Stanley, who wrote The Psychology of Money. There's aspects of his book that I don't agree with, but there's one thing that's super helpful. He says that money looks like math because it has numbers, but it's actually a psychology question. Right. And just like with most psychology questions, there's really no right answer. And that's one of the things which is why it's so important for people to own their power with money, because again, at the end of the day, what makes sense for one person may not make sense for you. There's so much cultural background and sometimes trauma that needs to be considered.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jasmine, for your time, for sharing your experience as a highly sensitive person, as somebody who works in activism, specifically in the world of finance. It can be a world that, I mean, it definitely needs a lot of activism, and it can be hard to live and work in finance.
Yeah.
Yeah. And where can people find your upcoming book? Where can people follow your work?
Yeah. So right now I am mostly on jasminerashid.com. So just my name.com. And really encouraging people to order the book, The Financial Activist Playbook, 8 Strategies for Everyday People to Reclaim Wealth and Collective Well-Being. Order it through your local bookstore. Amazon doesn't need the sales, and I don't need the sales to be through Amazon. And so really encouraging people to use independent booksellers, use bookshop.org, but it is available at any online retailer, and hopefully we'll be bringing it to a lot of in-person spaces as well as public libraries. So also feel free to order it through your public library so more people can have access to this resource.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time, and thank you for writing the book.
Yeah, thanks so much for again creating this space and having really important conversations. It's so needed, and I'm really grateful.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode in the second season of Highly Sensitive Money, where we talk about money, social justice, and how to do this well as a highly sensitive person. To learn more about my services, check out my website, allthecolors.net, where you can also find a really fun link to a quiz on money archetypes, because understanding our own patterns with money makes it much easier to make changes and get to where we want to go. If you enjoyed today's episode, please rate and review wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.